There are moments when an entire room falls silent, moments when a single sentence reveals more about a person than years of conversation ever could. On a cross-country flight from New York to Los Angeles, more than 100 passengers boarded expecting an ordinary trip. Business travelers checked their emails. Families settled into their seats. Flight attendants prepared for departure. Nobody imagined they were about to witness a confrontation that would leave an entire first-class cabin frozen in disbelief. And it all began with 7 words. "You're in the wrong seat." The words cut through the low murmur of the cabin like a knife. Heads turned instantly. Several passengers looked up from their phones. A flight attendant paused halfway down the aisle. The woman who had spoken stood perfectly still beside her seat, staring at the older gentleman seated next to the window. She looked polished, confident, and completely certain of herself. The man looked to be somewhere in his late 60s. Gray hair, simple blazer, reading glasses, a folded newspaper resting on his lap. Nothing about him suggested he was looking for trouble. Nothing about him suggested he even wanted attention. Yet attention had suddenly found him. The man slowly lifted his eyes from the page. He didn't appear angry. He didn't appear embarrassed. If anything, he seemed mildly confused by the interruption. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his boarding pass, and examined it carefully. The woman watched with crossed arms, as though she already knew exactly what he was about to discover. Around them, passengers exchanged curious glances. Everyone expected the same outcome. A quick apology, a realization that a mistake had been made, a polite move to another seat. Instead, after checking the boarding pass, the man calmly nodded to himself, folded the document, placed it back into his pocket, and returned to reading. The woman's expression changed immediately. At first it was disbelief, then irritation, then something else, something sharper, something that made the passengers nearby pay closer attention. She leaned forward slightly. "Did you hear me?" she asked. The man looked up once again. For a brief second, their eyes met. Then he offered a small, polite smile, a smile that somehow seemed to make her even more upset. The cabin had become noticeably quieter now. People were pretending not to watch, while very obviously watching. The flight attendants hadn't stepped in yet because, at least from a distance, it still looked like a simple seating misunderstanding. The kind of thing that happens every day on commercial flights. But this no longer felt like a misunderstanding. This felt personal. The woman took another step forward. Several rows away, passengers had stopped unpacking their bags. Others removed their earbuds. Everyone sensed that something unusual was unfolding. Then came the sentence that changed the atmosphere entirely. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you." For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The words hung in the air. Heavy, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. A few passengers exchanged uncertain looks. One man sitting across the aisle slowly lowered his phone. Another passenger glanced toward a flight attendant, wondering whether someone would intervene. The older gentleman remained seated. His expression never changed. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the woman for a few seconds before returning once again to his newspaper. That reaction seemed to frustrate her even more. Most people would have responded. Most people would have challenged the accusation. Most people would have demanded an explanation. But not him. And that silence was becoming impossible for the woman to accept. As the tension grew inside the first-class cabin, nobody could have guessed what was about to happen next. Nobody knew who the quiet man by the window really was. Nobody understood why he seemed completely unbothered by the growing attention. And absolutely nobody could have predicted that before this aircraft left the ground, the captain himself would walk out of the cockpit because of what was happening just a few rows behind him. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next transformed an awkward disagreement into a story that passengers on that flight would remember for years. A story about assumptions. As the tension settled over the first-class cabin, a question began forming in the minds of nearly everyone watching. Who exactly was Andrew Carter? The answer should have been obvious. He looked like an ordinary retiree traveling across the country. There was nothing flashy about him. No expensive watch catching the cabin lights. No designer luggage positioned beside his seat. No visible signs of wealth or status. Yet there was something unusual about the way he carried himself. Even while Karen Whitmore continued standing over him, Andrew showed none of the reactions most people would have displayed. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't intimidated. He wasn't eager to prove himself. It was as though he had experienced situations far more difficult than this, and had long ago learned that some arguments simply weren't worth having. For the passengers watching from nearby rows, that calmness became a mystery of its own. Because the longer Karen pushed, the less Andrew seemed interested in responding. Karen, meanwhile, appeared absolutely convinced she was right. The certainty in her voice never wavered. She looked around the cabin as though expecting others to support her. In her mind, there was only one explanation for what she was seeing. Somehow, this man had ended up in a seat that wasn't meant for him. Maybe he had read his boarding pass incorrectly. Maybe there had been a mistake at the gate. Or maybe, she believed, he was hoping nobody would question him. Whatever conclusion Karen had reached, she seemed determined to see it through. Every passing second appeared to strengthen her confidence. And that confidence was beginning to influence some of the other passengers. A few exchanged uncertain glances. Others quietly wondered whether she might actually be correct. After all, people often trust the person who speaks the loudest. People often assume confidence and truth are the same thing. But on this flight, those assumptions would eventually collide with reality in a way nobody expected. Yet while passengers focused on the confrontation, another story was unfolding just beneath the surface. Several members of the flight crew had begun paying unusually close attention to Andrew Carter. At first it was subtle, a glance held slightly too long, a brief exchange between two attendants, a look of recognition that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. Most passengers never noticed it. Karen certainly didn't. She was too focused on winning the argument. But if someone had been watching carefully, they would have seen something changing among the crew, something that didn't fit the narrative Karen was trying so hard to create. One flight attendant walked past Andrew and looked at him twice. Another seemed ready to say something before stopping herself. Then a third crew member quietly disappeared toward the front of the aircraft. None of it made sense. If Andrew was simply a passenger sitting in the wrong seat, why did the crew suddenly seem so uneasy? The mystery deepened with every passing minute. Because Andrew himself gave away almost nothing. He never mentioned his career. He never pointed to any accomplishment. He never tried to impress anyone. In fact, the more attention the situation attracted, the more determined he seemed to remain invisible. He turned another page of his newspaper. He adjusted his glasses. He looked out the window briefly before returning to his reading. To most people, it appeared impossible. How could someone remain so composed while being publicly challenged in front of an entire first-class cabin? What did Andrew know that everyone else didn't? And why did it seem as though some members of the crew were growing increasingly concerned about the direction this confrontation was taking? Meanwhile, Karen's frustration was becoming harder to contain. She had expected compliance. She had expected an apology. She had expected Andrew to stand up and move. Instead, his refusal to react was making her feel as though she was losing control of the situation. And for someone accustomed to getting immediate results, that feeling was unbearable. The cabin remained tense. Passengers continued watching. The crew continued exchanging glances. And somewhere near the front of the aircraft, information was beginning to move through channels Karen didn't even know existed. Information that would soon change everything. At this point, if you had been sitting in that cabin watching the situation unfold with no knowledge of what was coming next, whose side would you have been on? Would you have believed Karen Whitmore's confident accusations? Or would you have trusted the quiet composure of Andrew Carter? Because within the next few minutes, a discovery would be made that would force everyone on that plane to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the man sitting quietly by the window. Long before anyone in first class began questioning whether Andrew Carter belonged in that seat, he had already spent the morning doing what he had spent most of his life doing, moving through the world quietly, asking for little, and attracting attention only when absolutely necessary. At 68 years old, Andrew had developed a habit that surprised many people who knew him. He preferred arriving at airports early, not because he was nervous about missing flights, but because he enjoyed watching people. Families rushing toward gates, business travelers typing furiously into laptops, young couples planning vacations. For Andrew, airports were one of the few places where every person carried a different story, and he found comfort in observing those stories unfold around him. That morning had begun no differently. Hours before Karen Whitmore would confront him inside the first-class cabin, Andrew stepped through the terminal carrying a small leather travel bag that looked older than some of the passengers around him. His clothes were simple: a navy blazer, a light blue shirt, well-worn shoes polished carefully but showing signs of age. Nothing about his appearance attracted attention. If anything, he blended effortlessly into the crowd. As he moved through the terminal, most people never gave him a second glance. To them, he was simply another older traveler heading toward another destination. Yet what happened over the next hour revealed a pattern that few passengers on the flight would ever know about. Near a self-check-in kiosk, a young mother struggled with 2 suitcases while trying to keep track of a restless toddler. The child wandered several feet away before she noticed. Before anyone else reacted, Andrew quietly stepped forward and gently guided the little boy back toward his mother. He offered a reassuring smile, helped lift one of the heavier bags onto the scale, wished her a safe flight, and continued on his way without waiting for thanks. A few minutes later, he stopped to hold a door for an elderly couple navigating the terminal with difficulty. Then he helped another traveler retrieve a dropped passport before disappearing back into the crowd. None of these moments lasted more than a few seconds. None of them drew applause. Most went completely unnoticed. But they painted a picture of a man whose character revealed itself through small actions rather than grand gestures. When Andrew finally reached the airline lounge entrance, something unusual happened. The employee scanning boarding passes looked at his ticket, then looked back at him with an expression that seemed almost surprised. For a brief moment, the employee's eyes widened with recognition. Then a smile appeared, a genuine smile, the kind usually reserved for old friends rather than customers. Andrew nodded politely. The employee greeted him warmly and wished him a pleasant journey. To anyone nearby, the interaction might have seemed ordinary. Yet there was something about it that lingered. Something that suggested the employee knew exactly who Andrew Carter was. Andrew, however, behaved as though nothing unusual and continued walking. If he noticed the reaction at all, he gave no sign of it. Inside the terminal, the pattern repeated itself. As Andrew waited near his departure gate, an airport operations manager happened to walk past. The manager took several steps before suddenly stopping. He turned around. For a second, he appeared uncertain. Then he walked directly toward Andrew. The 2 men exchanged a few quiet words that nearby travelers couldn't hear. The manager smiled. Andrew smiled back. Then came something even stranger. The manager extended his hand with a level of respect that seemed unusual for a casual airport encounter. It wasn't the handshake of someone greeting a customer. It was the handshake of someone acknowledging a person whose reputation carried weight. Yet once again, Andrew treated the moment as though it were completely normal. The conversation ended. The manager walked away, and the passengers nearby returned to whatever they had been doing without giving it much thought. That was the story of Andrew Carter's life in many ways. People underestimated him because he never demanded attention. They looked at his age, his simple clothing, his quiet demeanor, and immediately reached conclusions. Some assumed he was retired and unremarkable. Others assumed he lived an ordinary life free from accomplishment or influence. Andrew rarely corrected them. He had learned years earlier that people reveal a great deal about themselves through the assumptions they make. And over time, he had become comfortable allowing those assumptions to exist. What mattered to him was not how strangers viewed him, but how he chose to treat them. That philosophy had earned him admiration in places most people would never think to look. Yet on this particular day, it would also place him directly in the path of someone who judged almost entirely by appearances. As boarding time approached, Andrew quietly joined the line of passengers entering the aircraft. He greeted the gate agent with the same politeness he showed everyone else. The gate agent's reaction mirrored the others. A brief look of recognition, a smile, a respectful nod. Then Andrew walked down the jet bridge and disappeared onto the plane. By the time he settled into his seat beside the window, he looked exactly like what most passengers assumed he was. An older man preparing for a routine flight across the country. Nobody around him could have guessed how many people had recognized him before he even stepped on board. Nobody could have guessed why airline employees seemed to react differently whenever they encountered him. And certainly nobody could have guessed that the answer to that mystery was already making its way through the aircraft as Karen Whitmore continued drawing attention to herself. Because several people at the airport had recognized Andrew Carter immediately. Most passengers never would. cabin changed the moment Karen Whitmore realized that neither Andrew Carter nor the flight attendant intended to give her the response she wanted. Until then, she had still believed the situation could be resolved through pressure. She believed that if she spoke firmly enough, loudly enough, someone would eventually agree with her. But when the flight attendant calmly confirmed that Andrew's boarding pass matched his assigned seat, Karen found herself facing a reality she wasn't prepared to accept. Instead of ending the confrontation, she doubled down. Slowly, she rose from her seat and turned toward the surrounding passengers. It was a calculated move. Whether she realized it or not, Karen was no longer speaking to Andrew. She was speaking to the audience that had gathered around the conflict. Every curious glance, every passenger pretending not to listen, every traveler watching from across the aisle had become part of what she viewed as her case against him. Karen's voice carried easily through the cabin now. She spoke with the confidence of someone who expected people to agree with her. She questioned how situations like this were allowed to happen. She suggested that standards had declined. She implied that rules were being ignored. While she never directly accused Andrew of wrongdoing beyond what she had already claimed, the message was clear enough for everyone listening. She wanted the passengers around her to see him the way she saw him. An outsider. Someone who didn't belong. Someone who had somehow ended up in a place reserved for others. The effect was immediate. A few passengers exchanged glances. One man several rows back nodded slightly as if he understood her frustration. Another passenger quietly whispered something to his companion. Human nature has a tendency to follow certainty, especially when the facts are unclear. And Karen projected certainty with absolute conviction. Yet not everyone was convinced. Several passengers remained silent, watching Andrew Carter carefully. The longer the confrontation continued, the harder it became to reconcile Karen's accusations with Andrew's behavior. He showed no signs of panic, no signs of guilt, no signs of someone worried about being exposed. He simply sat there with his newspaper resting on his lap, listening more than speaking. Occasionally he looked up. Occasionally he adjusted his glasses. But beyond that, he offered nothing. No argument. No defense. No attempt to win anyone over. It was almost maddening to watch. Even passengers who sympathized with him began asking themselves the same question. Why wasn't he saying anything? Why wasn't he standing up for himself? Most people have a breaking point. Most people eventually respond when they are publicly challenged. Yet Andrew remained remarkably composed, as though the outcome of this situation had already been decided long before anyone else realized it. The silence surrounding him was beginning to create its own kind of tension. Karen interpreted it as stubbornness. Some passengers interpreted it as dignity. Others simply found it confusing. Every passing minute increased the mystery. What did Andrew know that everyone else didn't? Why did he seem completely untroubled by the growing attention? Why did the accusations appear to slide off him without leaving any visible mark? The questions spread through the cabin. Passengers who had initially focused on Karen were now studying Andrew. They watched his reactions. They searched for clues. They wondered whether they were missing something important. And unknowingly, they were asking the very same questions that several members of the flight crew had already begun asking themselves. Meanwhile, Karen's frustration continued building. The reaction she wanted from the crowd wasn't materializing. Instead of unanimous agreement, she found herself facing uncertainty. Some passengers appeared uncomfortable. Others avoided eye contact altogether. The flight attendant who had initially intervened remained professional, but there was a subtle shift in her demeanor. She no longer seemed focused on resolving a seating dispute. She seemed focused on understanding something else entirely. As Karen continued speaking, the attendant glanced down at the passenger manifest once again. Then she looked toward Andrew Carter. Then back at the document. It was a small moment, one that most passengers missed completely. But something had caught her attention. For the first time since the confrontation began, the flight attendant studied Andrew's name more carefully. Her eyes moved across the page. Then they stopped. A brief look of confusion crossed her face. Seconds later, confusion gave way to recognition. She looked at Andrew again, this time much more closely. Suddenly, pieces that had not made sense moments earlier seemed to fall into place. The calmness, the confidence, the reactions from other airline employees. The strange feeling that she had seen or heard that name before. The realization arrived all at once. And the instant it did, her expression changed completely. What she had just discovered would alter the course of the entire confrontation. More importantly, it would trigger a chain of events that would soon reach the cockpit itself. Because the flight attendant had finally recognized the name Andrew Carter. And the moment she did, she understood that Karen Whitmore had made a mistake far bigger than anyone in that cabin could possibly imagine. The moment the flight attendant recognized the name Andrew Carter, something subtle but undeniable changed inside the first-class cabin. Up until that point, she had maintained the calm professionalism expected of every crew member. Her focus had been on de-escalation, on keeping a difficult passenger interaction from becoming a larger disruption. But now there was a new urgency in her movements. She glanced once more at the passenger manifest, looked directly at Andrew, then quietly excused herself. There was no announcement, no explanation, no attempt to draw attention. Yet the speed at which she moved toward the front of the aircraft immediately stood out to anyone paying close attention. Most passengers were too focused on Karen Whitmore to notice. Karen herself, however, noticed instantly. Unfortunately, she interpreted the situation completely differently than what was actually happening. From Karen's perspective, the flight attendant's sudden departure looked like confirmation. It looked as though the crew had finally realized the seriousness of the problem she had been pointing out all along. The confidence she had briefly lost returned almost immediately. She straightened her posture. Her expression shifted from frustration to satisfaction. To her, it appeared that action was finally being taken. She assumed the attendant had gone to verify her concerns. She assumed management was becoming involved. She assumed the process of removing Andrew Carter from the aircraft had already begun. That assumption gave her renewed confidence, and confidence made her even more determined to press her case. As the minutes passed, Karen's tone grew sharper. She spoke more openly than before. She questioned how such a situation could have been allowed to happen in the first place. She suggested that customer standards were declining. She implied that passengers who paid premium fares deserved better treatment. Every statement seemed designed to gain support from the people around her. Some passengers avoided eye contact. Others remained silent. A few listened carefully without committing themselves to either side. Yet beneath the surface, another story was developing. Several members of the crew had begun exchanging brief conversations near the front of the cabin. Their voices remained low. Their expressions remained professional. But there was no mistaking the fact that something unusual was happening. One attendant approached another. A few quiet words were exchanged. Both glanced toward Andrew Carter. Moments later, another crew member joined the conversation. Then another. None of them appeared relaxed. None of them appeared indifferent. Whatever information had just surfaced seemed to be moving quickly through the chain of command. Passengers began noticing the unusual activity. Even those who couldn't hear the conversations could sense the shift in atmosphere. The energy inside the cabin felt different now. More focused, more alert, more uncertain. And yet Karen continued misunderstanding everything she was seeing. She mistook concern for agreement. She mistook urgency for validation. Every whispered conversation among the crew convinced her she was winning. But if the crew agreed with her, why did they keep looking at Andrew Carter? That question lingered unanswered. Because the more the crew learned, the more nervous they seemed to become. Not nervous about Andrew. Nervous about the situation itself. Nervous about what had already been said. Nervous about what was continuing to unfold in front of dozens of witnesses. The mystery surrounding Andrew Carter was no longer limited to passengers. It had reached the people responsible for operating the flight. And with every passing minute, the significance of his name appeared to grow. What had the flight attendant seen on that manifest? Why had recognizing Andrew Carter's name changed her expression so dramatically? Why had recognizing Andrew Carter's name changed her expression so dramatically? Why were experienced airline professionals suddenly exchanging concerned glances? The answers remained hidden, but the consequences were already beginning to spread. Then, near the front of the aircraft, a crew member picked up an internal communication handset and made a call. It was a brief conversation. Only a few words. Yet those words were enough. Inside the cockpit, the captain listened carefully. His expression changed almost immediately. He asked a question, received an answer, then sat silently for several seconds. Because for the first time since boarding began, the captain had been informed about Andrew Carter, and what happened next would leave the entire aircraft stunned. By now, the atmosphere inside the aircraft had become impossible to ignore. What had started as a disagreement between two passengers had quietly transformed into something much larger. Conversations throughout the cabin had faded. Phones were lowered. Passengers who had been preparing for takeoff were now focused entirely on the drama unfolding a few rows ahead. Even those who had missed the beginning of the confrontation could sense that something unusual was happening. The tension seemed to hang in the air, growing heavier with every passing second. Karen Whitmore remained convinced that events were finally moving in her favor. From where she stood, the whispered conversations among the crew, the sudden urgency, and the phone call to the cockpit all pointed toward one conclusion. She believed her concerns had finally reached the people with authority to act. Then something happened that immediately captured the attention of everyone on board. The cockpit door opened. For most passengers, it was an ordinary sight. But for frequent travelers, it was unusual enough to attract notice. Captains rarely left the cockpit during the boarding process unless something required their direct attention. As the uniformed captain stepped into the aisle, conversations stopped completely. Heads turned almost in unison. The first-class cabin fell into an expectant silence. Several passengers glanced toward Karen. Others looked toward Andrew Carter. The tension that had been building for the last several minutes suddenly felt as though it was reaching its conclusion. Karen noticed the captain immediately, and for the first time since the confrontation began, a look of satisfaction crossed her face. This was the moment she had been waiting for. In her mind, the highest authority on the aircraft had finally arrived to resolve the situation. She straightened her posture and folded her arms confidently. She looked around the cabin as though preparing to be proven right. The certainty that had carried her through the entire confrontation returned stronger than ever. After all, why else would the captain leave the cockpit? Why else would someone at that level become involved unless there was a serious problem to address? Karen's confidence grew with every step the captain took down the aisle. But then something happened that nobody expected. The captain never looked at Karen. Not once. Instead, he walked directly past her. His attention remained fixed on one person, Andrew Carter. A wave of confusion moved through the cabin. Passengers exchanged puzzled looks. Karen's confident expression flickered for the first time. The captain continued forward until he stood directly beside Andrew's seat. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. The entire first-class cabin seemed frozen. Everyone watched. Everyone waited. Then the captain smiled. It wasn't a polite customer service smile. It wasn't the smile of someone addressing a problem passenger. It was the smile of someone greeting a person he genuinely respected. The captain extended his hand. "Mr. Carter," he said warmly. The use of the name sent another ripple through the cabin. Andrew looked up from his seat and returned the smile. He rose slightly and shook the captain's hand. The interaction was brief, but it carried a level of familiarity that instantly shattered every assumption many passengers had formed during the confrontation. Several people looked back and forth between the two men, struggling to understand what they were seeing. The captain's demeanor was completely inconsistent with the narrative Karen Whitmore had spent the last several minutes constructing. Karen's expression changed immediately. The certainty was gone. In its place appeared confusion, then concern, then something closer to disbelief. Because this wasn't how the situation was supposed to unfold. If Andrew Carter didn't belong there, why was the captain greeting him by name? Why did the interaction seem so respectful? Why did several crew members suddenly look relieved rather than concerned? The questions spread through the cabin faster than any answer could. Passengers who had quietly sided with Karen moments earlier now found themselves reevaluating everything. Others who had remained uncertain leaned forward, desperate to understand what they had missed. Even Andrew himself appeared completely unbothered by the attention. He spoke briefly with the captain, nodded politely, and resumed the same calm composure he had maintained from the very beginning. But the biggest mystery remained unanswered. The captain clearly knew who Andrew Carter was. The crew clearly knew who Andrew Carter was. Yet the passengers didn't. And neither did Karen Whitmore. Not yet. But within moments, the truth behind Andrew Carter's identity would begin to emerge. And when it did, every assumption made inside that first-class cabin would come crashing down. The silence that followed the captain's arrival felt different from the silence that had come before. Earlier, passengers had been watching a confrontation. Now they were watching a mystery unfold. Karen Whitmore stood frozen beside her seat, trying to make sense of what she had just witnessed. The captain hadn't questioned Andrew Carter. He hadn't asked to see identification. He hadn't treated him like a passenger whose presence required investigation. Quite the opposite. The respect in his voice had been unmistakable. The handshake had been unmistakable. More importantly, the look on the captain's face had been unmistakable. It was the look of someone standing in the presence of a person whose reputation spoke for itself. Yet for everyone else in the cabin, the biggest question remained unanswered. Who exactly was Andrew Carter? The answer began emerging in pieces. After exchanging a few quiet words with Andrew, the captain turned slightly toward the flight attendant who had first recognized his name. She nodded almost immediately, confirming what he already suspected. The captain smiled again before addressing Andrew with a level of familiarity that caught the attention of everyone nearby. "It is an honor to finally meet you, Mr. Carter." The words landed like a shockwave. An honor. Not a correction. Not a warning. An honor. Passengers who had been following the confrontation exchanged bewildered glances. Karen's expression tightened. The confidence that had fueled her accusations for the last several minutes was rapidly being replaced by uncertainty. She looked around the cabin as though searching for someone who could explain what was happening. But nobody around her had answers. At least not yet. Because the truth about Andrew Carter was far removed from the assumptions people had made when they first saw him sitting quietly beside the window. Years earlier, Andrew Carter had built a reputation throughout the aviation industry that few outside the profession had ever heard about. He wasn't famous in the traditional sense. His face never appeared on magazine covers. He wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't a billionaire. He wasn't someone the average traveler would recognize walking through an airport terminal. Yet inside aviation circles, his name carried enormous weight. Andrew had spent decades serving as a federal aviation investigator, examining incidents that most passengers never even knew had occurred. Throughout his career, he had developed a reputation for asking difficult questions, challenging assumptions, and uncovering problems that others overlooked. His work had influenced safety standards across the industry and contributed to changes that affected countless flights across the country. One particular investigation had become especially significant. Years before this flight, Andrew had helped uncover a serious maintenance and inspection failure that had the potential to place hundreds of passengers at risk. The investigation had been complicated, politically sensitive, and heavily scrutinized. Many people wanted quick answers. Andrew wanted the truth. He followed evidence wherever it led, regardless of how uncomfortable the findings became. The recommendations that emerged from that investigation eventually led to new procedures adopted throughout the industry. Procedures that improved safety. Procedures that prevented future incidents. Procedures that many pilots and aviation professionals still followed years later, including the captain now standing beside him. The realization began spreading through the crew first. Some already knew who Andrew Carter was. Others had heard stories throughout their careers. Several had studied reports that carried his name. A few recognized him immediately the moment they saw the passenger manifest. Suddenly, every strange interaction from earlier in the day made perfect sense. The airport employee who had smiled with recognition. The operations manager who had stopped to shake Andrew's hand. The gate agent who had greeted him differently than other passengers. The flight attendant who had stared at his name twice before hurrying toward the front of the aircraft. None of those moments had been random, and neither had the phone call to the cockpit. The instant Andrew Carter's name reached the captain, recognition followed immediately. The captain had trained under procedures that existed because of investigations Andrew helped lead. During his aviation career, he had studied lessons that carried Andrew's influence. To him, Andrew wasn't simply another passenger occupying a first-class seat. He was one of the people whose work had helped shape modern airline safety itself. Suddenly, every unanswered question inside the cabin had an answer. The greetings, the whispers, the concerned expressions among the crew, the hurried trip toward the cockpit, the captain's immediate response. Everything fit together. Everything. And as the truth settled over the first-class cabin, passengers began looking at Andrew Carter differently. Not because he had demanded respect. Not because he had defended himself. Not because he had revealed his accomplishments. In fact, he had done none of those things. The remarkable part was that Andrew had never once mentioned who he was. He had never attempted to use his reputation as a shield. He had never corrected Karen Whitmore by listing his achievements. He had simply sat quietly and allowed people to reveal themselves through their assumptions. For Karen, however, the realization was only beginning. Because while the rest of the cabin was finally discovering who Andrew Carter truly was, she was simultaneously beginning to understand what her own assumptions had cost her. And the most uncomfortable moment of the entire flight was still ahead. 10. Have you ever seen someone judged completely wrong based on appearances alone? How would you have handled Karen Whitmore's behavior if you had been sitting on that flight? Share your thoughts in the comments below because we genuinely love to hear your perspective. And if stories like this remind you why character matters more than status, be sure to subscribe for more unforgettable, true-to-life stories. There are many more remarkable stories ahead, and you won't want to miss them.